Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A warm welcome to Mena-Talk. I'm Jasmin Arémi, an editor at Mena-Watch, and our guest today is anti-Semitism researcher and sociologist Karin Stögner. She is a professor of sociology at the University of Passau. Today we want to discuss intersectionality and anti-Semitism with her. A warm welcome to you, Professor Stögner.
Hi.
It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Mrs. Stögner, how did you get into anti-Semitism research?
It was actually through reading critical theory. Quite early in my academic career, I realized that within critical theory, especially in the works of Horkheimer and Adorno, anti-Semitism assumes a truly pivotal position, particularly concerning the entirety of social theory. So it's not merely treated as just one prejudice or simply another form of discrimination. Instead, within critical theory's analysis, power relations prismatically converge in anti-Semitism. And when one engages with anti-Semitism, one simultaneously grapples with authoritarian tendencies, with people's repressed desires, and with modernity, which is bound to a dialectic. Thus, it can be said that within anti-Semitism and in its critique, a form of social critique is ever present, and that was what truly captivated my interest. That's what I found fascinating. And at the same time, I also saw that in the most important texts on the subject, like Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, written in the early 1940s, anti-Semitism sometimes appears in constellation with sexism. So the aim is to illustrate how anti-Semitism functions by employing specific gender stereotypes. It is demonstrated that sexism and anti-Semitism exhibit characteristics that are structurally analogous. There's a passage that says something like, "You can tell that Jews and women haven't ruled for millennia." And from that, you can deduce what the motivation for anti-Semitism actually is. Historically, Jewish people, both men and women, have been relegated to a socially powerless position. And precisely because of this powerlessness, because of this lack of rule, they are then accused of a grab for world domination. And it operates very strongly with gender images, as is already depicted in critical theory, and I further elaborated on this. And that was also the point that always interested me about it. What does anti-Semitism need to become such an efficient, effective form of ideology in order to become a whole worldview where anti-Semitism falsely explains the world? And for that, you need many elements from other ideologies, especially those related to gender relations, because only then can such a worldview, a false explanation of the world, be conveyed.
Another area you specialize in is intersectionality and feminism.
Yes, actually, in conjunction with critical theory, because the point was not to reduce power relations to a single point, not to a single contradiction, not to class contradiction, not to gender contradiction, and certainly not to the discrimination and oppression of racialized and racialized individuals. But instead, to view it all as a single entity, recognizing how these various moments intertwine and thus truly establish modern power dynamics. I found that very interesting from a feminist perspective as well, because of course women are not just discriminated against based on their gender, but also due to many other factors that have to do with other forms of categorization and societal fixations. And that's what truly captivated my interest in intersectionality. It's why I found it deeply connected to critical theory, because it tries to represent and thoroughly analyze power relations in their complete plasticity, as a whole, rather than just reducing them to a single point.
So, what resources does critical theory actually provide regarding the anti-Semitism we're currently discussing, and also concerning intersectionality and feminism? Why do so many anti-Semitic incidents or views occur precisely within these movements? Critical theory certainly offers certain foundational principles that can help explain things, but are there specific resources available for that purpose?
So, in principle, the anti-Semitism critique of older critical theory is extremely, very dynamic. dynamic. It approaches the problem from various directions. It sees it in connection with the formation of nation-states. It views this in connection with class society. So it views it in the context of modernity itself, anti-Semitism as a reaction to a modernity that was not fully realized. And here, all these moments now come into play, with Jewish men and women accused of representing modernity in such a way that it's directed against traditions, particularly against established gender relations. In anti-Semitism, Jewish men and women are regularly accused of advocating for women's emancipation, of actively promoting it with the deliberate intention of undermining and ultimately destroying the ingrained, established patriarchal traditional structures, all to bring about a significant fragmentation of the community. The interesting thing is that we can see this not only in European anti-Semitism, and not only in Western anti-Semitism, but that it's also very present in Islamic anti-Semitism. This moment, this accusation that Jewish men and women are held responsible for the collapse of traditional societal structures, the breaking apart of established community structures. So the fact that modernity leads to the breakdown of traditions is projected onto Jewish men and women, and they are accused of having malicious intent. And as I said, you can see this in all forms of anti-Semitism. Critical theory highlights this, and I believe we must build on it. So we have to, so to speak, update it. And update it in the sense that we also try to analyze, and this is possible, those forms of anti-Semitism that haven't been addressed in critical theory yet. This includes, in particular, anti-Semitism directed against Israel, which is also a form of projective anti-Zionism, on the one hand, and Islamic anti-Semitism on the other side. And one might well say that these are indeed the two most pressing forms of anti-Semitism prevalent today. These weren't even discussed in older critical theory, despite their existence. It's not as though anti-Zionism and Israeli Islamic anti-Semitism didn't exist even back then, you know. But nevertheless, in order to truly grapple with and explain today's anti-Semitism, we absolutely must take these emerging forms into consideration. And yet, even at that time, it was already evident that the anti-Semitic elements found within critical theory could indeed be reinterpreted and applied to these particular forms of anti-Semitism.
Was there a specific debate, perhaps around October 7th? October, where it then became clear to you that this prevalent intersectional approach harbors a significant issue with anti-Semitism.
Yes, October 7th, in its sheer vehemence and intensity, truly appalled me and left me utterly and completely speechless. The sheer immediacy and intensity with which a victim-perpetrator reversal occurred almost instantaneously following these genocidal, anti-Semitic, and misogynistic attacks on Israelis, coupled with the accusation that Israel was committing genocide against the population in Gaza, was truly appalling. The intensity of it truly struck me. However, the fact itself, that it occurred, didn't come as a surprise because, in actuality, intersectionality had already been heading in that very direction for quite some time. And indeed, this might also have something to do with critical theory, if one wants to phrase it that way, particularly with Angela Davis. Angela Davis was a student of Herbert Marcuse and also studied under Adorno in Germany. She was a civil rights movement activist who very early on contemplated the intricate links between race, class, and gender, particularly during the nascent stages of intersectionality's development. That was in the 1970s, 1980s. This concept truly evolved, and particularly after 9/11, the entire situation somewhat changed, you might say, in a direction where suddenly BDS gained support. That is, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, that Palestine was positioned as the central focus. And the entire concept, I would argue, became anti-intersectional in the sense that, contrary to what intersectionality truly intends, a multitude of diverse contradictions were not integrated and thoughtfully examined in their interrelationships. Gender contradiction, class contradiction, the contradiction between the global South and the West, or rather, the conflict within a racist society. What happened after 9/11 is that all these different contradictions more or less faded into the background, and a single one came to the forefront, namely the contradiction between the West and the global South. That became the contradiction par excellence, and the consequence was that the gender contradiction increasingly receded into the background, with the result that gender inequality in the global South was no longer addressed, or only very rarely, and above all, that anti-Semitism was overlooked, because from this viewpoint, Jewish people were not seen as members of a people persecuted for centuries, for millennia, but rather as representatives of the imperialist West themselves, with Israel serving as an outpost, so to speak, an outpost of the imperialist West within the global South. And because of that, very early on, there arose these kinds of, restrictions regarding a perspective on anti-Semitism, specifically within intersectionality. And anti-Israeli agitation from intersectional activists was already happening even before October 7th.
Could you perhaps identify some blind spots within this intersectional theory that have contributed to these oversimplified representations emerging?
On the one hand, I think these are indeed political and ideological constraints, narrowing down to a projective anti-Zionism, for which the concept of intersectionality has been instrumentally exploited. Yes, that particular direction definitely exists. However, the prevailing intersectional concept also possesses certain inherent pitfalls, which unfortunately render it incapable of truly analyzing anti-Semitism with its standard framework. And these pitfalls lie, in particular, in the fact that the concept of race that is used, the concept of racism as an ideology, the way it's framed, is primarily defined along the color line. That is, the contradiction between white and black. This is a contradiction not applicable to Jews, who are neither discriminated against nor persecuted in anti-Semitism due to their skin color, but rather for entirely distinct criteria. Moreover, racism as an ideology fundamentally aims to justify the systematic exploitation of human beings. And that is certainly not at the very core of anti-Semitism. In the context of anti-Semitism, there's also this accusation that Jewish individuals are actually driving the exploitation of the global South. They would, so to speak, represent capitalism as an exploitative system. They are representatives of this system. That is a very central statement of anti-Semitism. So, at the center of anti-Semitism, we have the world conspiracy mythology, that Jewish people pull the strings behind the scenes for their own interests. And that isn't found in common racism. This means that with this race, class, gender framework, anti-Semitism already falls out of the race category. You can't grasp it with that. And from that perspective, there's quite possibly a conceptual gap in the current intersectionality framework. However, this doesn't inherently need to escalate into anti-Semitism, since this concept emerged from a very particular historical situation, specifically the massive structural and overt racism prevalent in the USA during the 1950s and 60s. That was the background for this intersectionality debate. It wasn't about anti-Semitism at all. It was never formulated in a way that meant anti-Semitism should have no place. That only emerged later with these narrowing aspects within certain post-colonial debates where anti-Semitism became explicitly excluded.
From experience, would you say this misunderstanding is often more due to disinterest? Or is it at a point where you can say there's a systematic structure behind it?
Well, disinterest. I don't know. That would focus more on the actors. And I honestly don't think that the majority of these individuals would simply disregard anti-Semitism as an issue in itself. However, they severely narrow it down to a specific form of anti-Semitism, a racist form, one that, as people say, is directed against Jews as Jews. And in doing so, they completely overlook other forms of anti-Semitism that operate much more abstractly, specifically those directed against Israel, as Leon Polyakov termed it, when treated as the Jew among nations. This perspective also overlooks secondary anti-Semitism, which isn't targeted at Jews as Jews, but rather is focused on a very specific defense mechanism against memory. Perspectives on anti-Semitism also close themselves off to it, or rather are directed against it. So I really don't think it's about denying anti-Semitism itself. Instead, it's about making sure that these specific forms of anti-Zionism, which truly can manifest as Israel-related anti-Semitism, those very forms of anti-Semitism are not being brought into clear focus or adequately addressed. Since October 7th, the prevailing narrative has been context, 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 emphasizing a very specific framework. This framework suggests that the actions taken by Hamas are not acts of anti-Semitism, but rather a justifiable outcry from an oppressed people. And that this so-called legitimate outcry of an oppressed people, which then leads to the murder of Israelis, is also considered perhaps an undesirable yet understandable consequence of the entire situation. And ultimately, it's always about negating the state of Israel's right to exist. And the fact that many who engage in such discourses are actually using argumentation patterns very similar to those of right-wing extremists. I don't think many of them are even aware of that.
To come back to your work, and also to an important point that you just mentioned a moment ago, in your work, you frequently discuss this deeply problematic victim hierarchy game, including a victim-perpetrator reversal in certain leftist and gender studies circles. What I don't think most people consider is, how does this game or this perception actually affect the experiences of Jewish people and persecuted individuals who are truly affected?
Well, first, there's a very current example of how this is being carried out. So, one of the very prominent feminist critical theorists, namely Nancy Fraser, recently published a text entitled Gaza as World Event, in which she actually puts forward the thesis that Gaza has supplanted Auschwitz as the symbolic representation for the absolute worst atrocities, for the gravest of crimes of humanity today. And behind all of this is an extreme victim-perpetrator reversal and such a massive distortion of history. This is because it is being argued that Auschwitz was, in fact, a type of wartime event, or, conversely, that the brutal acts of war in Gaza are being reinterpreted as an outright genocide, and not just any ordinary genocide, but rather as the absolute worst genocide ever, specifically the one that truly supplants Auschwitz as a negative identification moment in Western consciousness. This is currently a very pressing narrative, one that is continuously escalating and becoming more and more overtly apparent. And naturally, it presents a very specific perspective, specifically that the Shoah, as one of the fundamental reasons for the establishment of the State of Israel, this is overshadowed by a new Gaza narrative and a new genocide narrative, and thereby implicitly also delivers the instruction that the founding of the State of Israel should be reversed, and a Palestinian state encompassing the entire area should be established in its place. Yes, this naturally brings into focus a very specific viewpoint, a very specific Jewish one, comes to the forefront. Nancy Fraser, she herself also repeatedly refers back to her Jewish ancestors. And so there is an identity struggle underway. And it is being borne on the shoulders of Jewish men and women who are indeed victims of anti-Semitism throughout the West. And you can easily see this and verify it through the data. Whenever Israel is subjected to an attack, Jewish individuals living outside of Israel are also placed in jeopardy of being targeted. And this indeed happens time and again. And that the numbers on anti-Semitism after the 7th, risen dramatically since October. One would expect such a brutal form of anti-Semitism to shock people into saying, this cannot continue. Yet, the opposite occurred. And we also know from research that whenever anti-Semitism manifests openly, it invariably leads to an increase in anti-Semitic acts, unless one takes a very decisive stand against it, that is. And this resolute opposition was notably absent in so very many places following October 7th.
In your publications, you extensively cover anti-Semitism, sexism, and racism. What then is actually the most important theoretical insight here, to be able to better understand the current situation and also the rampant anti-Semitism?
Yes, I think that you cannot fully grasp the vehemence and the sheer violence of anti-Semitism coming from Hamas if you don't simultaneously comprehend the misogynistic, the profoundly sexist component that is also inherent in it. And the sexist component of this massacre cannot truly be understood if one cannot also place it adequately within the framework of anti-Semitic ideology. So that means the October 7th massacres are an expression of the most massive misogynistic anti-Semitism one can possibly imagine. And it's crucial to recognize these two elements as intertwined, because otherwise you run the risk that it will be trivialized in one way or another, and that its true significance won't be grasped. And so I always advocate for seeing these moments as truly intertwined with each other.
To quote a question from your text, the new unwillingness to mourn. What happened that even critical theorists view Islamism as an alternative to Western modernity, legitimize Hamas as armed resistance, and in doing so, disregard both anti-Semitism and anti-feminism?
Yes, much occurred between September 11th, 2001, and the 7th of October. 2023, that's a long time, more than 20 years. However, within this time frame, we can indeed observe the evolution of a particular form of feminism, which we can appropriately term decolonial feminism. And this is a form of feminism that, while radicalizing modern critique, unfortunately takes it in a completely misguided direction. So, modern critique, in the sense that one actually seeks out the contradiction that modernity promises, humanity, equality, freedom, and so forth, but then doesn't deliver on its promises. That's a modern critique we're familiar with from critical theory, and one we absolutely ought to uphold. It's a form of self-criticism in the West, a Western self-criticism that absolutely must be practiced. But what happens here in many forms of decolonial feminism, which then enter into an alliance with Islamism, is that the critique of modernity is extended so far that modernity itself is rejected. That it's not about a specific negation of modernity, criticizing its negative aspects and wanting to strengthen and bring forward its good sides, but rather that modernity is rejected wholesale, and instead, the focus shifts to where are allies outside the West, outside of modernity. And then they truly believe they've discovered an ally in Islamism, because Islamism, naturally, massively repels and strongly criticizes the West. These are very strange alliances. They are alliances that are also known from the left. It's also called Islamo-leftism, or the Red-Green Alliance, alliances between leftists and Islamists. And the unifying element here is anti-Western resentment. And it's anti-Western resentment precisely because it is indeed directed against the liberating aspects found within the West, and because the West is suddenly perceived as solely repressive, the progressive facets of Western culture are completely overlooked and dismissed. Thus, it's not acknowledged that the West, which certainly warrants criticism, represents a form, a type of governance that has repeatedly ushered in catastrophes. Yet, simultaneously, and this too must be recognized, critique has consistently emerged within the West, and so the West cannot be reduced to just one side. Instead, as Horkheimer and Adorno put it, it's the dialectic of enlightenment, not its outright negation. And I believe that this element of dialectics has been lost in these forms of feminism, and also in these specific segments of the global left, the Western left. This element of dialectics, of thinking in contradictions, has been lost. So the West is unequivocally depicted as being unambiguously repressive. And interestingly, this unambiguity is also brought to the forefront with respect to Islamism, namely, as being clearly directed against the West. And everything else that Islamism brings with it, that it's misogynistic, that it's anti-Semitic, that it's against emancipation, is, so to speak, taken into account. It's accepted. And that's precisely why, in such an alliance, and this is evident after October 7th, if one chooses to regard Hamas as legitimate armed resistance against Israel, then one must completely overlook the anti-Semitism inherent in it. This occurs daily by claiming it's not anti-Semitic, but simply resistance. Anti-feminism must also be conveniently overlooked, which is a daily occurrence as well, by outright denying that any rapes ever took place, by pushing forward various forms of relativization, by portraying the entire situation as Israeli or U.S. government propaganda, by issuing warnings that sexual violence must never be instrumentalized in a racially biased manner. Thus, all these are moments operating on distinct levels that collectively and perpetually contribute to the continuous overlooking of anti-feminism, sexism, and anti-Semitism. This is again the pivotal moment where one recognizes, in the 2000s, how the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign essentially embraced these Western feminists, providing them with a completely new and impactful platform.
In your texts, you very often analyze imagery, symbolism, also at demonstrations, anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli demonstrations and campaigns. And where do you find the intertwining of these anti-Semitic, sexist motifs most strikingly evident?
Yes, it's quite evident in the iconography. It becomes strikingly apparent when feminist or queer feminist activists proudly display "I love Hamas" stickers and parade around with them. This is especially noticeable when accusations of pinkwashing arise, which are simultaneously anti-Semitic and sexist. These accusations apply vastly different standards to Arab nations and Israel. It's noticeable when Gaza is declared the center of the world, and not in a manner where one would genuinely consider the actual living conditions in Gaza under Hamas's dominion, and then proceed to criticize Hamas's administration. Instead, it transforms into nothing more than a hollow, empty vessel, which can then be imbued with anti-Western self-reflection. This is also quite evident in protest slogans like "Hands off Gaza" and "Hands off Iran," which completely sidestep any critical examination of the misogyny and anti-Semitism of the Iranian regime or Hamas. Nor is it about genuinely focusing on the actual living conditions of the Iranians and the Iranian women. That one would bring them to mind, and that one would bring their struggle against the Islamic regime to mind. Instead, it's always about using that as a stage. Yeah, therefore, Gaza here is not at all a space that would genuinely exist, where actual governance unfolds. Rather, Gaza is transformed into a mere stage upon which one can project and perform their own dissatisfactions with the West. And so, this has very little to do with the actual living situation in Gaza. And you particularly notice this because anti-Semitism is overlooked, racism is overlooked, sexism is overlooked, the enormous power structures are simply overlooked, and everything gets reduced, so to speak, to a singular actor in the region, and that actor is supposedly Israel. If not for Israel, the region would be free. That is such an utterly blatant, redemptive anti-Zionism being presented here. And what's more, it's disguised under a feminist mantle. Yes, you see that again and again at demonstrations like these.
In your lectures, you've raised the question, is an intersectional critique of anti-Semitism even possible?
Well, you get the distinct impression that intersectionality is now something one could readily dismiss, as it's a form of theorizing where, ultimately, Israel is always held responsible for everything. And indeed, that is often the case when it comes to intersectionality. Nevertheless, I still have the aspiration to reframe and reclaim intersectionality in a different way. This is because, firstly, I believe that the concept, when truly traced back and understood as intersectionality, where various forms of domination intersect and collaborate, is genuinely valuable and beneficial. And in that respect, I want to hold on to it. But there needs to be a re-intersectionality, if you can put it that way. What we're seeing now is basically anti-intersectionality. As I've already pointed out, everything is brought back to a single contradiction. The contradiction between the global South and the West. And then all other contradictions, they just fall by the wayside. But if we endeavor to reintroduce complexity into it, then I truly believe that the concept proves to be quite helpful. Firstly, because it is on everyone's lips, and because, as a critic of anti-Semitism, I don't think you can just let it stand that there's such a prominent concept that is repeatedly instrumentalized for anti-Semitism. So I think you have to work against that very forcefully, and you can do that by actually focusing on ideologies. And I tried to do that by imagining anti-Semitism as an intersectional ideology. And indeed, anti-Semitism is an intersectional ideology, or perhaps the intersectional ideology par excellence, in the sense that the elements with which anti-Semitism operates are not always per se, through and only anti-Semitic, but they are sexist, they are homophobic, they are racist, they are nationalist, they are perhaps even anti-nationalist. They have a lot to do with the class structure of society, in that Jews are accused of being representatives of capitalism, in that anti-Semitism is presented as if it were a rebellion against capitalism, in that it is presented as if anti-Semitism were an outcry against imperialism. Thus, we've gathered all the various aspects within anti-Semitism that inherently coalesce and interplay within the comprehensive framework of the intersectionality paradigm. We have race, we have class, we have gender, we have capitalism in it, we have the nation-state order in it, we have colonialism in it, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, one can approach anti-Semitism with an intersectional perspective and, so to speak, start an intersectional analysis of anti-Semitism. And there, I believe, we can indeed present a counter-concept of intersectionality and convincingly demonstrate that it is not intersectionality itself that is inherently anti-Semitic, but rather that it is always a deliberate choice made by the individuals and groups involved, whether that leads in an anti-Semitic direction or not. So the concept itself is not anti-Semitic. I would insist on that.
Do you still see a way to address this through dialogue in an academic context?
Yes, I can certainly see that when I introduce such an interpretation of intersectionality in my lectures and seminars, it definitely sparks significant interest. That it's not instantly dismissed, that people at least become attentive and think, yes, of course, that's possible. And it doesn't always have to go that way, just as post-colonial theory doesn't always have to be anti-Semitic. There is post-colonial. You can actually defend Israel using post-colonial theory by perceiving Israel as a post-colonial nation. Some people do that. So in that respect, one must also counteract this polarization in academia. And you can achieve that by trying to reclaim certain theorems and by trying to reframe them anew. Not artificially, but seeing if the concept truly allows for it. And I truly believe that intersectionality offers a significant potential for greater enlightenment, leading to a deeper understanding of the situation's inherent complexities. Also, that anti-Semitism is a very complex ideology, one that cannot simply be captured by a single explanatory model, but rather one which truly benefits from drawing upon diverse elements, and indeed from actively seeking out the varied components and inherent contradictions within anti-Semitism itself. That's the core of anti-Semitism. It thrives on contradictions. The figure of the Jew in anti-Semitism is so conflicting that he is for. That gender stereotypes are particularly at work here. that he is portrayed as both hypersexual and impotent, simultaneously as dirty like nature and as a representative of anti-nature, at the same time as nationally particularistic and also as internationalist, cosmopolitan, and so on. All these contradictions are inherent in anti-Semitism. We must identify them, and then, using an intersectional concept, they can be made quite understandable and explainable.
Indeed, you are an author, and you have already published various works and several publications. Your new book, entitled Anti-Semitism and Sexism, has just been released. What exactly is your new publication about? Would you like to say a few words about it?
Yes, I'd really love to. So, it's just been published in English. Anti-Semitism and Sexism, Ideological Constellations before and after October 7. Many years ago, I wrote a book in German on anti-Semitism and sexism. And October became, so to speak, the pivotal occasion for me to once more deeply consider this interconnection, this mediation of ideologies, since the 7th of October. That was indeed one of the most extreme expressions of this very interplay, in a rather drastic way. So I rewrote the book, rewrote it in English, always against the backdrop of the 7th of October, always with the attempt to analytically penetrate October 7th, not to understand it, because you can't understand it, but to try to explain, both October 7th ideologically, and also to explain the resulting reactions to it. And it was important then, as I've already mentioned, to use critical theory to analyze forms of anti-Semitism that critical theory hadn't yet analyzed, namely Israel-related anti-Semitism and Islamic anti-Semitism. Therefore, I didn't merely wish to rehash what had happened, but rather I genuinely intended to analytically intervene here, to delve into the very core of this issue. What is actually specific about Islamic anti-Semitism? Why is the gender dynamic such an extremely significant aspect of Islamic anti-Semitism? Why are Zionists depicted as the subverters of the Ummah within the ideology of Islamism? And why is the Ummah so strongly defined by unequal gender relations, by gender apartheid? And how does all of this connect in turn? And how do Western, not only feminists, but also leftist actors and actresses react to this conglomerate, to this very vividly complex ideology of Islamism? This is the content of this book, and I approached it from various perspectives. I examined the connections within conspiracy ideologies. I explored how, from the Volkisch movement through National Socialism and up to Islamism, a particular ideological thread. The threads of an ideological history are constantly reformed, how new stories are always introduced, but old ones are also reactivated. What influence modernity has, what influence the nation-state order has, especially against the background of the founding of the nation-state of Israel. Also, the impact an anti-national ideology from Hamas here plays. What influence certain forms of denial of experience play in the West? That certain forms, specific expressions of anti-Semitism, are not acknowledged or are perhaps intentionally ignored. This raises the question of what factors contribute to this oversight, and more precisely, how it is intertwined with the presence of feminist identity politics. Anti-Semitism is ignored, what that in turn is connected to, and how that is connected to a post-colonial turn, so to speak. That is really at the very core of this book, which, as I mentioned, was for me a complete reevaluation, a total rethinking of the complex connection between anti-Semitism and sexism.
Thanks, MSTOG-NER, for the insights and being our guest.
Thank you for having me.
Until next time.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this talk, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell. Find more analyses and discussions at www.Mena-Watch.com. I'm Jasmin Arémi. Thanks for watching. Until next time.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.